Hello, bruvs. We're back with the Memoirs of Bridget Hitler, edited by Michael Unger, a illustrated book by Duckworth from 1979. And we will start chapter 3, which is kind of a section, not a chapter, but we'll go with chapters since it's easier. For the duration, it was utterly impossible for me to make contact with my husband. Nevertheless, I was confident that Alois would survive the terrible Holocaust. He was so resourceful, I was sure he would be able to find a safe berth. When the war was over at last, I tried to get in touch with him. Soon after the armistice was signed, all who had relatives and friends on the continent other side made efforts to locate them. I wrote to the Irish agency, for that had been the last address he gave me. My letter was returned with the notation, addressee unknown. I also wrote to my sister in law, Angela, at her old address. There's Angela Robble, seated left, with her daughter, Julie, in the center. I think she's the one that gets murdered, and her sister Paula seated right, taken in Vienna. And after a time, she replied, she was living in Vienna with her 3 children and younger sister Paula. Life was very hard. She knew nothing of either her brothers, having lost contact at the beginning of the war. She also informed me that her husband, Leo Robble, had been killed in the war. Perhaps her brothers had shared the same fate, though it might turn out that they were only prisoners. I didn't give up hope. It had been announced that some 500,000 Austrian soldiers were still in Russian hands as prisoners of war. Many of them had not yet returned due to the revolutionary conditions in that country. Perhaps, as Angela suggested, my husband and Adolf were among them. Little information reached us from that part of the world, none about prisoners of war. There wasn't much I could do but wait for word from him. Of course, if Alois was all right, he probably would have little difficult finding me. A letter sent to my address before the war would reach me, because my parents had now moved over to Liverpool from Ireland and bought the eight roomed house in which I had previously been living. Pat and I shared it with them. Then the tragic news came that made any further search for Alois pointless. In the spring of 1920, I went one evening to Edelweiss House, a restaurant that Alois and I had frequented. One of the waiters, a former employee of my husband's, told me that he had been waiting for a long time for me to come in. He took a folded letter from his wallet, telling me it was from another German waiter named Ernhard Ernst, who had written from Germany and asked him to get in touch with me. The letter related that my husband had, had suffered a serious wound early in the war and had been hospitalized for months. Ernst and he had been in adjoining beds, and each had agreed to carry messages for the other in case either failed to recover. Ernst had been the one to whom this grim Jesus. Ernst had been the one to whom the grim duty fell, and he was anxious to execute it. He begged his friend to get in touch with me and tell me. Unfortunately, he wrote, Mrs. Hitler will not even have the sad satisfaction of visiting his grave, for the hospital where he died is in the Ukraine. The Bolsheviks are in control. There is revolution. Actually, this news brought no material change in my own or my son's life, as since my husband's departure, I had been living like other war widows, working and keeping things going as well as I could. My situation, however, oh man, was much worse than that of other women in England who had lost their husbands in the war. I was married to an Austrian, a man who had fallen fighting England, or at least her allies. I didn't receive a widow's allowance or other privileges. As a young girl, my great desire had been to go on the stage, but I couldn't do any more than dream because my conservative family did not think it suitable. What do you got, bruvs? They had no objection, however, to my singing in the Dublin choir, and when I was married, although Pat took most of my time, Alois, who was musical himself, encouraged me to keep up with my singing lessons. For 3 years, I studied with the Mayfair School of Music under Mr. Gregory Hast and Sir Landon Ronald. Now that Pat was no longer a baby and my family less reluctant, there was no reason why I shouldn't realize my youthful dream, and that was exactly what I did. I played in comedies and reviews. I toured with Harry Lauder's company. The book is called The Memoirs of Bridget Hitler. She was the half sister-in-law of Adolf Hitler, and this is her memoir where she claimed that Hitler went to Liverpool and stayed for like 6 months in 1912 or 1913. Historians discredit that concept, but this is what she had to say. One of the tours took me to the continent. We played in Holland, Belgium, and finally France. Lions, or is that Lyons? Lions, Nice. No, that's Nice, isn't it? Lions, Lyons, and Nice. I don't know how to say this bullshit. And then Monte Carlo. That was where I saw my husband. I was in the chorus on the brilliantly lighted stage. Although the audience was in darkness, I could see the faces of the people in the first few rows. Suddenly, it was as though everything disappeared, except the face of one man. It was Eloise, older and heavier, his mustache cropped smaller, but unquestionably my husband. He was sitting in the second row with a woman of a rather Mongolian cast of features. With slanting eyes and dark hair, he had recognized me at almost the same instant. Before I realized what was happening, he whispered something to his companion, then they both rose and left. The shock was so overpowering that I had no idea how I I failed to give the least outward sign of it. And there's Alois Hitler, half brother of Adolf. The only explanation that occurs to me is that I was so well drilled in my part that I did it mechanically, without the slightest thought or pause. And anyway, no one had the faintest idea that anything had happened. It wasn't until I was back in the dressing room with the girls that I began to react, that I began to shiver as though I had taken a chill. And it was only then that I had time to think. There was no possibility that I could have made a mistake in identity, for if it had been merely a stranger who resembled Alois, why should he have got up and gone out? Yes, certainly it was Alois, and the woman with him, was she my successor? I thought of the many times Alois had brought me to Monte Carlo, when he was still in love with me. Had I believed that my husband was dead, or had I subconsciously felt that he would turn up one day, almost against my will, I realized that I had never believed he was dead. What a curious thing, then, that now that I was sure he was alive for the first time, he became dead to me. Well, that was what he wanted, wasn't it? That was what he meant me to think. And that message from the waiter, why hadn't it struck me at the time that it was odd that a careless young waiter should go to so much trouble to send me a message? All right, see ya, bruv. I saw clearly now that it had all been planned. Eloise had sent me the message. I remembered how he had said I couldn't visit the grave, even if I wanted to, because it was in the Ukraine. A wave of fury swept over me. What a rotten thing to do. What a grim joke to play on one's wife. All right, if he wanted to be dead, so far as I was concerned, he could be dead. As I look back, there is only one thing that troubles me. I didn't tell Pat. He was such a sincere, serious boy. I knew it would hurt him terribly to learn that the lost father he loved was just an unfeeling man trying to evade the responsibilities of marriage. Pat was very grown up for his 10 years, and I know he regarded me as much too young to be taken seriously as a mother. In fact, we more or less grew up together. The question of his father was practically the only one on which I ever deceived him, and I wish now I hadn't. I would have saved both of us a great deal of pain and trouble. As the years passed, Pat was developing wonderfully. He was in the boarding school at Ashford and was everything I could have wished. He was an earnest member of the Boy Scouts. His teachers praised him. He had written an essay, which now only took first prize but was read before the assembled school. He showed definite artistic talent and had a keen imagination. I was very proud of him. Naturally, in common with all children who have lost their father, he conjured up larger than life size pictures of him, trying to recall favorably significant things he had glimpsed as a child. In Pat's affectionate view, this selfish, thoughtless man had become a hero. Mothers are not always as intelligent as they should be about their children. Instead of telling him the cold facts of our relationship, I spoke of Eloise as little as possible, thus leaving a blank canvas on which Pat's imagination could work. One curious fact escaped me entirely. Pat's instinct that his father was alive and would return one day. This happened in November 1923. After an absence of a few months, I went to my son's school in Ashford to visit him. Pat, proud as punch, showed me a newspaper containing an account of an unsuccessful coup d'etat which had taken place in Munich. It was the famous Munich Putsch, organized by Adolf Hitler, which had taken the military authorities 24 hours to suppress. Adolf Hitler, Pat was insisting, must be his uncle. I took the newspaper in my hand. I looked at the photo. Adolf's face had become more mature and somewhat fuller. Otherwise, there was no great change except for his mustache. When Adolf had come to visit us in Liverpool, his mustache had been of the handlebar type, rather full and soft. Long before that, I had persuaded Alois to cut off the wax points of his a la Kaiser. When Adolf came, I set to work on him too, and succeeded in getting him to trim it. Now I said that it had decreased still more, almost to a ridiculous degree. Eloise's mustache had grown narrower too when I saw him in Monte Carlo. It looked much better than Adolf's. I had started them in the right direction, but Adolf had gone too far. I read an account of what had happened since he left England. When the war started, he had entered the German army, where he became Gefreiter, the equivalent of a lance corporal. At the conclusion of the war, he joined a political party, later becoming its leader. When his beer hall putsch turned out to be a fiasco, he was arrested. Now he was to be tried for treason. Pat brought out his own treasured photograph album and displayed a photograph. Alois stood with his arm on Adolph's shoulder. It had been taken in one of their sightseeing tours in London. As they stood in front of the photographer, they appeared to be loving brothers. Pat compared this old photograph with that in the newspaper. They are exactly the same, he said, and I'm sure Uncle Adolf will answer my letter. I looked at him amazed and inexplicably disturbed. Your letter? Well, I wrote a letter to the mayor of Munich asking him to get in touch with my uncle Adolf Hitler and tell him that we, his brother's widow and son, are living here and that he should inform us of all the details of my father's death in the war and where he is buried so that when I'm older I can go there. I didn't know what to say. His desire to know all about his father was so natural that I could find neither heart nor courage to tell him the truth. I prayed his letter would never reach Adolf. Fate decided otherwise. There was a reply, but it was not from Adolf. Dear madam, it read, it has come to my notice that you have been making inquiries for me, and I beg of you to state what it is that you want of me. It was signed Alois Hitler and came from Hamburg. This was all I needed to set my Irish temper ablaze, and I wrote back that I wanted nothing from him, but that I felt he owed something more to his son than the cold response elicited by his inquiry. The reply I received from my husband was undoubtedly the strangest piece of writing I have ever read. A storm had been unleashed by Pat's innocent inquiry. By chance, the letter had come into the hands of an officious member of the Munich municipal authorities who, whether moved by pity for the deserted mother and child or by the desire to harm Adolf, had instigated an official investigation in connection with the allegedly dead brother of the Munich putsch leader. The investigation disclosed that my husband not only was not dead, but on the contrary, had married a certain Hedwig Heidemann and was living with her and a child born of their illegal union. As soon as he was in possession of the fact, the conscientious official had succeeded in having Alois charged with bigamy. With a curious mixture of naive candidness and cold cynicism, Alois told me what had prompted him to write to me after 10 years of silence. He had been called to the office of the Lord Mayor of Hamburg for questioning. I quote, I then denied nothing but gave a statement to this effect, with the exception that I don't regard this marriage to be legal because it is not registered at the Austrian consulate. This statement I had to sign. Please send the statement to the public prosecutor at Hamburg, and he threw in information from the Austrian consul as to the legality of the marriage. The Austrian council declared that it did not matter to the legality whether the marriage was registered or not. The marriage is therefore to be regarded as legal. This declaration, as well as my own statement, was the basis upon which the public prosecutor won the charge of bigamy against me. My solicitor told me that now the only chance to clear me is to have our marriage legally dissolved before the trial of bigamy comes on. It is the only way to save me from the worst by you doing me this favor. If you deny this to me, then the future will prove to you that you have been doing wrong. It is not only for my benefit, but for yours and Willie's as well. I also want to remind you of one fact. Don't think that I am at present a rich man, for to tell you the truth, I am not. But I have got the chance to get rich by the aid of my brother's reputation. This chance will be lost forever if I am found guilty, and if I get sentenced. The letter now took on a new and different tone, saying that he had believed Willie and I were dead, eagerly assuring me of his eternal devotion over and over again. Of course, there wasn't a word to explain why he had got his friend Ernst to send me a message that he had died in the Ukraine, nor did he indicate in any way on what he had based the belief that he claimed that Pat and I were no longer among the living. Neither did he explain why he had not made the slightest effort to find out what had become of us, or why, if I was really the great love of his life, he had scurried away when he recognized me in Monte Carlo. I wondered if the woman I had seen was Hedwig. She had looked Slavic rather than German. Then the letter went on. You must help me or they'll put me in jail. This bigamy charge is mainly embarrassing, for should the newspapers learn about it, they're going to use it against my brother, who, as you must have heard, is the leader of the German political party, which has missed reaching the top only by a hair's breadth. Although he is successful, I shall be in a position to compensate you for everything and could recompense you for all the expenses you have had in bringing up our boy and educating him. Up to now, I could not share these experiences with you, for I have been living in very poor circumstances. The last pages of the letter deal exclusively with Pat, whom he still calls Willie. One passage runs, certainly I'll always stand up for the little darling boy, who once was in the sole possession of all my affection. And it is quite as you say. This poor little chap with his lovely, lovely blue eyes and fair hair, of which I still have some in my possession, is a victim of unfortunate circumstances. I sat at the dining room table at the home Pat and I shared with my parents. It was almost dark by the time I had waded through the contents of the letter, and I still remained there, staring into the air, absorbed and puzzled. What ought I to do now? I put the question to myself again and again, considering how I might spare my son the disclosure of this distasteful scandal. At this point, Pat came into the room. He needed only a glance at my face to sense that the pages lying in front of me on the table must have been the cause of my distress. Bad news? He asked, looking at the letter. I had no will to deceive Pat any more, or even to take the letters from his hand when he picked it up. Struck by the signature, he turned a puzzled face towards me and asked, Is my father alive? Was this letter written by him? I stood up then and went out without answering. My heart was too full to speak. I left my son alone with the father he had found at last. An hour passed before Pat came out, holding the letter in his hand. When I had left him in the dining room with his father's letter, he was an innocent 13-year-old boy. But now, as he stood there before me, looking at me with stony, suffering eyes, he seemed to have grown into a man in that hour. Tell me, mother, did you know my father was alive? Yes, I did, son. But why didn't you tell me? I didn't want you to have anything to do with a man who deserted you and for 10 years didn't take the slightest interest in what happened to you or me. I wanted to save you from disappointment and disillusionment. Pat shook his head, his face shadowed with disbelief. Maybe he really did think we were dead. England was bombed by the Zeppelins. After all, we had some narrow escapes. Maybe someone told him we were killed in the raids. I knew the struggle that was going on in my son's soul. My poor boy, whose cherished dream had suddenly come true, was trying to hold on to it, not wanting to give up the father he had just found. After this first communication from my husband, I was literally bombarded with letters from him. Adolf was mentioned in many of them. Eloise had evidently experienced a change of heart towards his brother, as may be seen from the following letter. Concerning my brother Adolf, I'll write you a letter shortly. Only one thing I'll tell you today about him. The reason you don't hear anything about him now is because they keep him captured in the castle at Landsberg in Bavaria. On 18 February starts a big trial, and then I am sure you will hear again enough of him. I would recommend you to follow up the reports about him there. One thing, and there we go. This is a picture of, oh, that must be Adolf Hitler. Dude, he looks like, what's his name? Jeremy, whatever that guy's name is. There's Hitler reading the paper, and who's this? Hitler again, doing something. One thing is sure to be, he will go out of it and win his battle easy and in honor. Most of the romantically flowery letters had only one object: to persuade me to get our marriage dissolved in some way, perhaps by claiming I was a minor when it had been performed, or that I had signed my father's name to consent. In that case, he wrote in one of his letters, "It is true that Willie will be an illegitimate child temporarily, but that shouldn't worry you, for after the conclusion of the case I am willing to adopt him." Of course, my being a Catholic made the whole affair doubly difficult, not to mention distasteful. Eloise's letters grew more and more desperate. One concluded, "This I tell you, that they will not get me into prison alive." Not so much for myself as for my son, I felt I could do nothing but hold my position. That if either of the marriages was to be erased from the record, it should be the second. Certainly that was the one that would be considered null and void by law and by right in any civilized country. Eventually, a legal separation was effected, although we could not be divorced in the eyes of the church. That didn't disturb Alois. Anyway, Adolf was going to institute reforms in the field of marriage, Alois informed me. Nothing about the affair ever became public. The court took into consideration the deposition I sent to Hamburg, requesting that my husband should not be punished for his offense, since he had believed that my son and I had been killed in the raids and was consequently innocent of any willful wrongdoing. Accepting this plea in principle, the court fined Eloise the minimum amount, 800 Reichmarks, without loss of civil rights. Contrary to report, Eloise did not go to prison, but received instead a sentence particularly equivalent to actual acquittal. After the trial was over, I received a letter from my husband thanking me for loyally standing by him and predicting that Adolf would soon be on top. In later letters, Adolf, to whom Alois now referred as uncrowned king of Bavaria, was a favorite topic. Adolf was to do this. Adolf was going to do that. Adolf had written a book called Mein Kampf. I would hear about it. To me, they sounded just like the old stories of how Alois was going to make a fortune, but one great plan for the future grew out of the other, and at least Alois was showing some interest in his son when he wrote, "Furthermore, in England he will always be a young man like millions of others, but in Germany he will be one of the only descendants representative of the man who bears the most prominent name of the present generation of Germany. It is my intention to put Willie in a position to enable him to make provision for you in days to come. Willie, with his excellent character, is well aware of the fact that in our complicated case, it is his duty to do so. I therefore propose to him to come over here in the course of next summer. In the meantime, he must learn as much German as possible, for it is important that he be able to talk at least a bit." Letter followed letter. Several times Eloise had invited Pat to visit him, but it was not until 1929, when my son was 18 years old, that he met his father. At the time, 1929, Germany was fleetingly a modern democracy. The so-called Weimar Republic, the National Socialist Party, was slowly becoming the most important in the country, and the eyes of the world were focusing on its leader, Adolf Hitler. The English newspaper reading public evinced intense interest in the activities and personal history of the rising politician. They wanted to know everything about his family, his origin, and his past. Munich, the obvious source of information, refused to publish any details concerning the person of the leader, restricting their releases to purely official propaganda material. It was only natural, therefore, that the moment the newspaper disclosed that a sister-in-law and a nephew of Adolf Hitler were living in London, where we had moved, public attention turned towards us from all directions. I really couldn't say whether it was the newspapers which first blew our sorry status or whether my son or I myself. Come on. Unintentionally made known the fact that we were related to Adolf Hitler. Suffice to say that from that time on, we were a constantly recurring sensation in the London papers, which presented us as a special delicacy in the way of piquant reading material. Whenever Hitler did or said something startling, the London newspapers sought out my son asking for statement about his uncle. Although Pat was only 18, he was employed by an engineering firm in Wigmore Street in London. An old friend of ours, Mr. J.E. Barrow, secretary and chief accountant, recommended him for the position. Naturally, Pat was greatly impressed by the fact that his uncle had reached such a high position in the world. To me, it seemed incredible. I asked myself over and over again what could have happened to the German people that an insignificant man like Adolf, whom I had known as an unwanted and disagreeable guest, should have been chosen as their leader. Where was this man going to lead that people? Good question. And that's meant for later since I'm tired as hell. So I'm done. Goodbye, bros.